Marine Reserves Bill at its third reading.
I call Moana Mackie.
Oh, she's earning her salary tonight. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very happy to stand and take a call on the subject. Oh, calm down. It was just a joke, Mrs. Collins. Have a sense of humour. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, I am very happy to stand and take a call on the Subantarctic Islands Marine Reserves Bill. And it was a very interesting bill and an enjoyable experience having this bill at Select Committee. I wish we had more pieces of environmental legislation coming to the Local Government and Environment Select Committee that we could all agree on and that are actually doing good things for the environment as opposed to undermining and destroying the environment, which is usually the tenor of environmental legislation we deal with at that Select Committee. But in this instance, it was a very good piece of legislation. I think it's important to note that nearly all the submitters who came along did say they didn't think this went far enough. They were very supportive of the protections that were being put in place, but they did feel that the areas being protected weren't sufficient, and we responded by amending the review period in this legislation down from 5 years down to 2 years in order to reflect the fact that they didn't want that review period to wait. They didn't feel that we needed to wait that long period of time in order to make those decisions and determinations. This bill will create 3 marine reserves, the Antipodes Island or Moutere Mahui, the Bounty Islands Marine Reserve or Moutere Hauriri, and the Campbell Island Marine Reserve or Moutere Ihupuku. And these are incredibly important parts of our subantarctic ocean. They have been recognised as World Heritage Sites, and in that respect we welcome this piece of legislation. And marine reserves have had a bit of a bumpy ride in New Zealand in general. I think it's fair to say that in terms of marine policy right across the board, we're kind of playing catch-up. We don't really know a lot of what's out there in our marine environment, particularly around the various ecosystems, around the makeup of the sea floor. In fact, the Australians have a lot more information than us, Mr. Speaker, because when they did a lot of their oil and gas development in the 1970s, they required the companies to do that work and to provide that spatial information about the marine environment to the government, and they've been able to base a lot of their policies and decisions on information that they required as a bottom line and as a condition of that activity going ahead. And we haven't had the benefit of that. So what's happened is we've had, right throughout the decades, sometimes rather piecemeal approach to how we deal with marine policy. And as previous speakers have said, it would be very, very desirable to see a far more coherent approach to marine policy in New Zealand, to have a strategy for how we want to use, to enjoy, to extract resources from our marine environment, but have a strategy instead of having siloed debates around each of those issues without connecting them up. And that, unfortunately, is what has been missing in New Zealand. And again, comments were made around the fact that we have benthic protected areas, but then we have issued mining permits in those benthic protected areas. And for a lot of the general public, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Why would you create these protected areas and then allow mining to go ahead? And these are conversations where we have enormous numbers of layered pieces of legislation all sitting on top of each other, different strategies, different approaches, but it's difficult to find a coherent strategy for the use and enjoyment and protection of our marine environment. So marine reserves have had a long history in New Zealand, but we haven't actually gone that far in terms of the percentage of our marine environment that is put into these protected areas. And they are important because they are very effective. And we have a marine reserve up near where I live, from Puawa, just north of Gisborne, up to Whangarā. And it was very controversial when it went in, because when you're dealing with marine policy, because that work hasn't been done, there are a lot of existing interests there now. There are a lot of people who make their livelihood out of that environment. So when you start to talk about changing the way in which they may have to operate in that environment, sometimes they don't like it. And there was real concern that we were, I think they called it locking up the ocean, cutting off large parts of areas that have previously been open to fishing, shutting those down. And of course, the idea of locking up an ocean isn't very real. Fish aren't going to magically stay within a marine reserve or will go outside it. They don't need passports. Thank you, Mr. Prasad. But what in fact happened was, within a very short period of time, we saw an incredible resurgence of the fish stocks. And the fish stocks within the marine reserve, we saw species coming back that we hadn't seen for a long time in our waters. And this was in a relatively short period of time. And I think Chris Carter was the Minister of Conservation at the time when we'd been up there. It was only 4 years after that marine reserve had been created, and they had a PhD student who was doing her PhD work on that particular marine reserve. And what she was doing was she was measuring the amount of legal size crayfish that she was getting outside of the marine reserve and comparing that to inside the marine reserve. And bear in mind that, of course, crayfish also aren't going to... they don't know where the marine reserve is. Well, I don't know, maybe they do, but it would seem unlikely. And yet, outside of the marine reserve, after 4 years, and we have a real issue with our crayfish stock on the east coast. It is really heavily depleted. What they saw was, outside the marine reserve, she was getting half a kilogram of legal size cray per pot. Inside the marine reserve, over 30 kilograms of legal size cray per pot. And so that was an extraordinary resurgence of our crayfish stock, which was in serious trouble. And so what happened was, the fishermen, actually quite liked the marine reserve, because the best fishing was suddenly on the border of the marine reserve. And everyone would say, well, how are the fishermen going to know where the marine reserve is? Well, anyone who didn't know where the marine reserve boundary was just had to look at where all the fishing boats were, and it was pretty clear where the boundary was. And what happened was, there's a reef at Whangarā, which wasn't actually included in the marine reserve initially at the time. And they actually ended up with an unofficial agreement to extend the marine reserve out over that reef in order to protect the crayfish stock. And it was fantastic, because kids would come down and go out to Whangarā, they'd go walking on the reef. You could actually, the crayfish were walking around in the day with their antennae sticking out of the water, which is highly unusual because they're meant to be nocturnal. But they were walking around, the kids were getting to see crayfish in their natural environment. And Doc said to us, when we send people down to actually just check on the stocks and do some of the chipping that they do and the tracing, he said people actually ring the police and say someone is fishing in the marine reserve, they're taking crayfish out of the marine reserve. And so then, of course, the police would say, no, that's a dock worker and he's just there making sure that everything's okay. So we've had an incredibly positive experience of that particular marine reserve on the east coast, and that's why Labor would like to see more of these marine reserves created. And I think the issue of the Subantarctic one does raise an interesting difference, which is it's one thing to police marine reserves which are just off the coast of New Zealand like this one. Policing them in the areas that are far away from New Zealand is a completely different matter. And there is clauses in this bill to allow rangers to be appointed from the New Zealand Defence Force, but I know that there have been concerns around fishing boats that have been seen around the Kermadex Marine Reserve, and from time to time other concerns are raised about fishing boats that just seem to be kind of hanging out there, foreign fishing vessels. There's really no reason why they would be there. And these people do email us and say, well, hey, look, we've contacted Ministry of Primary Industries, they really don't seem that fussed about it. But unless it's going to be policed, and these marine reserves that are far offshore, unless they're going to be policed, or checked, and however that's done, then you can pass all the marine reserve law in the world, but if people can just breach it and there's no consequences, then it does undermine that particular piece of legislation. So we're very happy to support this legislation. I'd say to members on the other side of the House, I don't want to get too carried away. We're not solving climate change here. It's a good piece of legislation. But there is an awful lot more to do. And as previous members have said, when we look at our marine ecosystem, it's tied into our rivers and our waterways in New Zealand. The entire health of that marine ecosystem is linked with the health of our land, with the health of our fresh waterways, and we can't just divorce them from each other and pat ourselves on the back for doing this whilst we turn the Tukituki River toxic in Ruataniwha, which is going to spill out into the marine environment. You can't just separate everything out and pretend that they don't all join up, because that's not how these ecological systems work. We need to look after our environment on land, at sea, in our freshwater waterways, in the air, and until we have a change of government, unfortunately, we're not going to get that kind of strategic approach.
Very good.
I call Claudette Hauiti.
Katoa ke a hau ki te mihi i a koe.